There are things my grandfather kept quiet about his whole life, not because he was a secretive man, but because he believed certain truths are best held the way you hold water in cupped hands, carefully, without drawing attention, until you understand exactly where they need to go. I didn't understand any of that the morning my brother Warren came to my door and told me I was getting married. He stood in the hallway of what had been our grandfather's house and delivered the news the way he delivered most things. Flat, final, already decided. The Macready outfit up on Powder Creek needed a wife. I was 24, unattached, and in Warren's accounting, taking up space on a ranch that was no longer mine to count as home. I'd be riding up there at the end of the month. There was nothing to argue about. He'd already shaken hands with Holt Macready at the September Cattlemen's Association meeting in Buffalo. I was 24 years old, and I had spent every one of those years on Aldridge land. I had pulled calves in February mud and ridden fence in heat that turned the air above the short grass into something that shimmered. I knew every waterhole and every cutbank on 6 sections of deeded ground in Johnson County, Wyoming. I knew where Aldridge Creek ran wide and cold after the spring melt and where it narrowed to a muddy trickle before September. I knew which panels in the South Corral needed replacing before shipping season, and which saddle horse would walk right through a gate you'd left unlatched. I knew that place the way you know something you have given your whole self to year after year, without being asked and without being thanked. Warren knew almost none of those things. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. My grandfather, Emmett Aldridge, had come into the Powder River country in the spring of 1887 with 60 head of crossbred cattle, a homestead claim on 160 acres, and a conviction that a man's whole worth could be traced to 2 things: the water he held and the cattle he kept honest. He was a quiet man, not cold, not distant, just economical with words in a way that people who work outdoors tend to get after enough years. He believed that if you had to say something twice, you probably hadn't said it right the first time. He taught me almost everything I know about cattle country, and he did it without much speech. When I was 7, he put me on a gentle sorrel mare named Patch and rode out to check the south fence after a hard winter. He didn't explain what we were doing or why. He just pointed at a broken post, handed me a pair of pliers, and waited. I fixed it badly the first time, and he showed me how to do it properly without making me feel stupid about the first attempt. That was how he taught everything. Show, wait, correct if needed, move on. By the time I was 16, I was riding Aldridge Creek every spring to check the headgate. Emmett had a water right on that creek that predated almost everything else in the county, a priority date of April 12, 1889, filed with the Wyoming State Engineer's Office, giving the Aldridge outfit the right to divert 42 miners inches of water from the creek for stock and irrigation. In the prior appropriation system, date is everything. First in time, first in right. Emmett's date was earlier than most other rights in that drainage, which meant that even in a dry year, the Aldridge water right was called before the neighbors' rights were. He understood this. He talked about it only once, on a July evening when we rode up to check the headgate together, and he said to me, not to the air, not to the horse, directly to me, "Clara, the water made everything else possible. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." I was 17 then. I didn't fully understand what he was putting in my hands with those words. I do now. There was a particular kind of teaching Emmett did that I only recognized for what was long after the fact. He would take me somewhere and let me look at something for as long as I needed to look at it, without explaining what I was supposed to see. The year I was 19, he drove us out to the far eastern section in the old pickup and pulled up at the fence line and sat there with the engine off. I looked out at the pasture. It was August, the grass worn down to stubble in places, yellow along the south slope. I said, "You took too many AUMs off this unit." He said, "I know. Neighbor to the east convinced me. Won't happen again." He didn't say you're right, or that's smart, or anything else. He just started the engine and drove us home. But I thought about it for the rest of the summer. A man who had been running cattle for 40 years, admitting to his 19-year-old granddaughter that he'd made a mistake, without embarrassment, without explanation, because the grass was the record and the record was plain. He showed me the tally books the winter I turned 20. Every head counted. Every transfer documented, every brand inspection recorded going back to 1912. He kept them in a tin box in the tack room, organized by year, and he'd go through them with me at the table on winter evenings when there was nothing pressing outside. He said once, studying a page from 1947, "Your Uncle Clevis tried to convince your great-granddad these records didn't matter. Said it was all going to be settled by handshake anyway." He turned the page. Then there was a lawsuit over 40 head. Records settled it in 3 days. He put the tally book back in the box and looked at me. "Paper is patient," he said. "It waits longer than people do." I was 23 years old, and I had kept that tally box current through his final 2 years of life, because his hands had started to shake in the cold and the writing was getting hard for him. I didn't tell him that was why I'd taken it over. He didn't ask. My brothers Warren and Roy had grown up on the same place and absorbed almost none of it. Warren was 11 years older than me and had left for college at 18. Come back at 24 with a business degree from the University of Wyoming and a set of opinions about ranch efficiency that nobody who actually worked cattle found useful. Roy was 8 years older than me and had never had much patience for anything that moved slower than he wanted it to. He liked the idea of the ranch, the name on the gate, the cattle that looked impressive from a truck window, the annual Cattlemen's Association banquet where he could talk about head counts and market projections. He didn't care much for the actual work, which is a serious character flaw in a ranching country where the work is everything. Emmett saw them clearly. He didn't say much about it, but you could tell. He'd ask them direct questions about the herd and listen to the way they answered, and his expression would get very still in a particular way, the way a man's face gets when he is working hard to keep what he thinks off of it. He kept working with me instead. He taught me to read the grass, to know when a pasture was being overgrazed before the numbers told you. He taught me the brand, a capital A with a running bar beneath it, the running A, registered originally in 1888. He taught me the record keeping in the tally books, how to count cattle so the count was accurate. He taught me how to talk to the brand inspector and what the inspection records meant. He taught me the water right documentation, the priority certificate, the headgate measurement, the diversion records you were required to keep each year by law. He treated me as though this knowledge was being entrusted somewhere specific, not just passed to the nearest available person. I see that clearly now. Then I thought he was teaching me because I was the one who showed up. Emmett died in February, 3 years before Warren appeared in my doorway. He went the way men like him sometimes go, without much announcement, in the early morning, before anyone else was up. I was the one who found him. I'd gotten up at 4:30 to start the wood stove the way I always did, and his door was still closed at 5, which was wrong, because he was always up first. Warren and Roy drove home for service. After the burial, they stayed. The changes started almost immediately, though they called them improvements. Warren hired a ranch manager from Gillette, a man who'd never worked cattle but had managed a feedlot operation, and that tells you nearly everything. Roy negotiated a lease arrangement with an outfit from Colorado that ran yearling steers, turning the upper Aldridge pastures into something that looked like a commercial feed yard for 5 months of the year. The headgate on Aldridge Creek was left to whoever felt like adjusting it, because neither Warren nor Roy knew what was for. I went up and maintained it myself, weekly, through the spring diversion season, without telling them, because the alternative was watching a senior water right go unexercised and risk abandonment proceedings under Wyoming law. I kept working. I kept records. I kept my mouth closed, mostly, because I had learned from Emmett that speaking too soon rarely helped anything. And then Warren came to my door with his news about Holt Macready. The arrangement, as I understood it, had come out of a fence line dispute that went back 2 seasons. The Macready pasture on the north end of their Powder Creek place shared a boundary with the Aldridge upper pasture, and somewhere in that fence line, there was a section that had been letting Macready cattle drift onto Aldridge grass. Roy had been threatening legal action. Holt Macready, apparently, had been patient about it up to a point and then had driven down to the Aldridge place to settle things in person. I wasn't home when that meeting happened. I was up on the summer range, moving cattle. Whatever was said between Warren, Roy, and Holt Macready that afternoon produced a handshake agreement that included me. The fence line dispute would be settled. The Macready water access from Aldridge Creek overflow would be formalized, and I would go up to the Macready place and marry Holt. Warren presented it to me as a sensible arrangement. He even seemed to think I might be grateful. I packed a bag and rode north at the end of October. The Macready place sat in a small sheltered valley off Powder Creek, between two low ridges that broke the north wind and held the snow off the south-facing slopes well into the spring. The headquarters wasn't large. A 2-story house with covered porch, a good set of working corrals, a barn that was older than the house but solidly maintained, a hay shed, a tack room built as an addition off the east side of the barn. The whole place had the look of a ranch run by someone who understood what mattered and didn't spend money on anything else. Holt Macready came out of the barn. When he heard my horse, he was maybe 34 or 35, with a broad, weathered face and dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore a canvas ranch coat and a battered felt hat, and he had a particular set to his shoulders that you see in men who have worked outdoors their whole lives. Not stiff, not casual, just present. He took hold of my horse's bridle, without being asked, and looked up at me. "You be Clara Aldridge," he said. "I would." He held the horse steady while I climbed down, then led her to the hitching rail and tied her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they're trying to read honestly, without deciding in advance what it says. "I want to say something before we go inside," he said. "You can take it however you like." I waited. "I know this wasn't your idea," he said. "I know how the arrangement came about, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend it was anything other than what it was. Your brothers wanted the fence dispute settled, and they figured this was a clean way to do it." He paused. "I want you to know I'm not holding you to something you didn't agree to. If you want to turn that horse around and go back, I won't say a word against it. But if you're willing to give this a chance, I'll be straight with you. That's all I can promise right now, but I mean it." I stood there on the gravel of the Macready yard and looked at this man I had never met, who had just been more honest with me in 30 seconds than my brothers had been in the previous 3 years. "I'll give it a chance," I said. He nodded once and led my horse to the barn to unsaddle her himself. He didn't ask me to wait in the house or make some show of hospitality. He just went and took care of the horse because the horse needed taking care of. That told me more about him than anything he could have said. Orville Bent was the only other person on Macready Place. An old hand who had worked for Holt's father for 30 years and simply kept working when Holt's father died. Orville was somewhere between 65 and 80, depending on who was asking, and he moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned to conserve himself without stopping. He nodded at me when Holt introduced us, looked at me for a long moment with gray eyes that seemed to be doing a quiet calculation, and said, "I knew Emmett Aldridge. Good man." That was the last personal thing he said to me for about 3 weeks. Then one morning in November, I came out to the barn before first light, and he was already there, working the stiffness out of hay fork that had rusted at the joint. He looked up when I came in. "Your granddad ever tell you how he got that water right?" Orville said. I said Emmett had filed it in 1889 when he proved up his homestead claim. Orville nodded. Filed it himself. Drove to Buffalo in a wagon to do it. Took him 2 days each way. He said later the county clerk told him most of the other homesteaders in that drainage hadn't bothered. Figured water was water. He worked the fork joint a little more. Emmett figured right. He went back to what he was doing. I went back to mine. That was the end of it. But it was also the beginning of something else. Orville understanding that I had known Emmett, not just of him, and me understanding that Orville had been paying attention to me since the first morning, and that his silence had been a kind of measuring, not an indifference. I found my footing at the Macready place the way you find your footing anywhere new, slowly, by doing the things that needed doing. There was plenty. The fall works were still running. Cattle to gather off the summer allotment, yearlings to sort and ship, a corral to repair before the ground froze. I worked. I didn't ask permission, and I didn't announce what I was doing. I just did what needed to be done and waited to see how Holt would take it. He didn't seem to take it as anything other than normal. He'd come back from the upper pasture and see that the corral panel I'd marked in the morning had been reset properly, and he'd go on with whatever he was doing. He didn't offer compliments, and he didn't condescend by explaining that I'd done it right. He just acknowledged it by how he moved past it, the way you acknowledge solid work by not having to address it. About 2 weeks in, while we were sorting cattle in the pen. He pulled up alongside me on his horse and said, without looking at me, "What do you think about the yearling heifers? The ones from the West Draw." I'd been watching them. 3 or 4 of them aren't going to hold their weight going into winter. The big brindle one especially. I'd either get them on some supplement or cut them early. He looked at them for a minute. "That's what I thought too," he said, and moved off to cut the brindle one from the group. He'd asked for my opinion because he actually wanted it. I sat there on my horse for a moment after he rode off, and I had the peculiar sensation of being seen, which is different from being looked at, and which I had not felt in a long time. By November, I understood I had married an honest man, which sounds like a small thing until you spend enough time around dishonest ones. Warren called in early December with an invitation. He was hosting a gathering at the Aldridge place. A few neighbors, some association members, a couple of the buyers they'd been working with on the lease arrangements. He wanted Holt and me to come. He said it as though it were a family occasion. A meal, some conversation, nothing formal. We drove down on a Saturday morning. Holt's truck, the highway, and then the county road that ran along the base of the ridge, and turned into the Aldridge gate. The place looked different from how I'd been keeping it. The South Corral, the one I'd been worrying about before I left, had not been repaired. 2 horses I didn't recognize stood in the near pasture. The water tank by the barn was iced over in the middle of the day, which meant nobody had gone out to break ice that morning. Inside, Warren had set up chairs in the main room and put coffee and food on the table. Roy was there, and about 12 other people. Dale Chambers and his wife Lila from a neighboring outfit, Pete Greer, who had hired on with my grandfather 12 years ago and was still riding for the brand, a couple of members of the Johnson County Cattlemen's Association, who I recognized but didn't know well, and 2 men in cleaner clothes than everyone else who I took to be the outside parties Warren had been negotiating with. Warren was in a good mood. That usually meant something was about to happen that benefited Warren. He talked for a while about the ranch, how it was positioned for growth, how the new lease arrangement with the Colorado outfit was going well, how the upper pastures were producing good returns per acre. He talked about a deal he'd been exploring with a gas company that had been running seismic surveys on 2 of the eastern sections. He mentioned he'd sold off the older brood cows at the September sale, 112 head, and had reinvested the proceeds into younger replacement heifers from a feedlot in Torrington. Lila Chambers, sitting 2 chairs down from me, glanced sideways when he said that. She'd been running a cow-calf operation for 20 years, and she knew what it meant to sell a whole class of proven breeders and replace them with feedlot heifers. It meant you'd sever the genetic line that a ranch takes a decade to develop for the sake of a quick reinvestment that looked good on paper. She caught my eye for half a second and looked away. He talked about all of it the way a man talks about an asset he is managing, not the way a man talks about something he has spent his life building. Pete Greer sat with his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the floor. Then Warren mentioned the water. He said the arrangement with the Macready outfit had cleared up the long-standing question of access to Aldridge Creek overflow, and that it was now properly documented as part of the marriage settlement. He said it cheerfully, like he was announcing a problem solved. He looked at Holt when he said it. Holt looked back at him with an expression that gave away exactly nothing. Roy, who had been quiet up until then, said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not because it was the cruelest thing anyone ever said to me, but because he said it in a room full of people I'd grown up around, with the easy confidence of someone who didn't think it would cost him anything. Clara always did think she ran the place, Roy said. Turns out she was better off married. Got herself a nice ranch up north. We kept things simplified down here. Works out for everybody. A couple people laughed, politely. One of the men in the clean shirt smiled. Pete Greer put his coffee cup down and stared at the wall. I sat with my hands in my lap and let the words settle. I didn't look at Roy. I didn't look at Warren. I looked at a point somewhere above the kitchen door, which was the same thing I had done when I was 12 years old, and Roy had told me in front of the hired hands that girls couldn't figure out calving math. It was the same wall, almost, same kitchen, same particular way the light came into the window above the sink. I thought about my grandfather, about the way he'd stood at that same sink, his hands wet from washing up, and said to me without turning around, people who need to take things from other people usually can't stand the thought that those people earned them. He'd been talking about a neighbor at the time, but he'd known I think that I'd need to remember those words for something closer to home. I didn't say anything in that room. Warren went on talking about the future of the Aldridge Ranch. Roy poured himself more coffee. Holt drove us home that afternoon without much conversation, and when we got back to Macready Place, he unhitched the trailer while I went inside, and we ate supper without talking about any of it. That night, after the dishes were done, Holt sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote something for a few minutes. Then he set the pencil down. "I want to check something at the courthouse," he said, "about the water right." "What about it?" Warren said it's documented in the marriage settlement. Water rights don't transfer that way. A prior appropriation right can't be assigned as part of a marriage contract. There's a separate process. And before it can be transferred at all, someone has to file with the state engineer's office. He looked at the paper in front of him. "I want to know whose name that right is actually in." The letter from the Wyoming state engineer's office arrived on the 14th of December, addressed to Clara E. Aldridge, in care of the Macready Ranch, Powder River Route, Johnson County. I turned it over my hands twice before I opened it. It was a standard notification letter. The office had received an application to transfer a water right recorded as priority certificate number 371. Aldridge Creek, original priority date April 12, 1889, from the current holder of record to a new entity. As the holder of record, I was being notified of the pending transfer application and was required to appear or submit written authorization within 45 days if I wished the transfer proceed, or submit written objection if I did not. I read it again. Then again, the holder of record, current holder of record. Holt read it over my shoulder, and when he finished, he said, "I thought so," and put on his coat and his hat, and told me he'd be back from Buffalo by supper time. He came back before 4 o'clock. He set a manila envelope on the kitchen table and sat down across from me and opened it without preamble. Inside were photocopies from the county recorder's office, certified by the county clerk, along with a printout from the state engineer's database. "Start with the water right," he said. The original priority certificate was dated April 12, 1889. The right was registered to Emmett James Aldridge, and upon his death, to his granddaughter Clara Emmett Aldridge, as sole successor holder of record. The priority date was legitimate. It appeared in the state engineer's records as the fourth oldest diversion right on that creek, with a diversion rate of 42 minors inches for stock and irrigation purposes. The annual diversion records, which holders were required to maintain, have been filed every year through the present, because I have been filing them, riding up to headgate every spring and fall, and recording the diversion the way Emmett had taught me. My name was on those records, every one of them. The second document, Holt said it was a deed, a warranty deed, recorded with the Johnson County clerk on September 9 of the year before Emmett died, conveying to Clara Emmett Aldridge, in fee simple, free of encumbrance, Section 14, Township 45 North, Range 81 West, Johnson County, Wyoming. The home section, 640 acres. The headquarters, the house, the corrals, the barn, the ground where the house sat, and where I had grown up. A deed recorded at the county courthouse has precedence over any will. A will distributes what the deceased owned at the time of death. Emmett had deeded Section 14 to me before he died. He no longer owned it when he died. Whatever Warren and Roy had inherited through the estate did not include the home section, because Emmett had already given it away. I sat with that deed in my hands for a long time. "There's one more," Holt said. It was a brand registration. The running a brand. Wyoming Livestock Board, re-registered on June 3rd, 2 years before Emmett died, in the name of Clara Emmett Aldridge. Not in the ranch's name, not in a family trust. In my name, with a note in Emmett handwriting in the margin of the application form, which had been copied with the record. This brand to be held and used by Clara Emmett Aldridge in perpetuity as her property, not as part of the general estate. The brand inspector's signature was at the bottom. The registration was valid and current. I looked at Holt across the table. He looked back at me. "Your brothers either never checked these records," Holt said, "or they checked them and said nothing." I thought about Warren standing in my doorway, telling me I was getting married. I thought about the particular way he presented it. Not as a question, not as an option, as a transaction already completed. I thought about Roy's face at the gathering, when he'd said she got herself a nice ranch up north. The relief behind those words. The relief of someone who has moved a problem out of the room. They knew, I said. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The question that took me longer to answer was what my grandfather had intended. He'd been a quiet man, not a complicated one. He didn't do things for dramatic effect. He recorded that deed and re-registered that brand and wrote Clara Emmett Aldridge into the water, right? Because he had thought about it carefully over time and concluded it was the right and necessary thing to do. I thought about the years I had ridden Aldridge Creek to maintain the headgate, and I remembered a specific morning, maybe 8 years before Emmett died, when I come in from checking the diversion, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and some papers in front of him. He looked up and watched me take off my boots in the entry and hang up my coat, and then he said, "You're the only one of 3 of you who knows what that headgate is for." I'd said something like, "Well, somebody had to know." He'd said, "Yes, that's right, somebody did." I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. Sitting at Holt's kitchen table with the water right certificate and the deed and the brand registration in front of me, I could hear it perfectly. Not the words exactly, but the weight of them. He'd been telling me something. He'd been putting it in my hands without putting it in my hands yet, waiting until I needed it. He'd known Warren and Roy would take the ranch if he let the standard course of things unfold. He'd known they would sell what they could sell, and lease what they could lease and run down what they couldn't bother to manage, and that by the time anyone paid attention, the cattle and the water and the brand would be gone. He'd made it so that couldn't happen completely. He'd put the most important things somewhere they couldn't reach. He'd put them with me. I sat at that kitchen table for a long while without saying anything. The fire in the wood stove had burned down the coals, and the kitchen was getting cold, and I didn't notice. Holt got up at some point and put more wood on without making it into an event. And he sat back down and waited while I sat with my grandfather's intentions laid out in front of me. The water commission would be coming. I said, "Finally." "Yes," Holt said. "The state engineer's office will send someone to verify the right before the transfer can go forward. Your brothers filed a transfer application without your authorization, which means they either didn't know whose name the right was in, or they thought they could get away without your signature. Or they thought I'd never find out. Or that," he agreed. "What do I do?" Holt folded his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said exactly the kind of thing I had come to understand he would say, which was a plain, honest thing. "You go to that meeting," he said, "and you show them the documents, and you let the law do what the law does. Your grandfather put his name on things very carefully for a very long time, and he put your name on the right things. The record will hold." I looked at him across the table. This man I had ridden north to marry at the end of October, who had been more straight with me in 2 months than my brothers had been in my entire life. "You could have not told me," I said. "The letter came to this address. You could have said nothing." He looked at me steadily. "Yes," he said, "I could have." That was all he said. He didn't make more of it than it was. He just let it sit there, plain and honest, the way he did everything. The water commissioner, Gene Duval, called ahead before he came. He was a compact, careful man from the state engineer's Sheridan Field office who spoke with the measured precision of someone who had spent 20 years adjudicating water disputes and had learned that imprecise language created expensive problems. He drove out to the Macready place on a Tuesday morning in January with a briefcase of records and a manner that suggested he was not in the habit of being surprised. I had called Warren the night before and told him the water commissioner was coming. I did not tell him what I'd found. I said only that there seemed to be a question about the transfer application and that he should come down. Warren arrived with Roy, which I had expected. They drove in 20 minutes after Duval, which was about right. They'd been watching the road. Pete Greer's truck was already in the yard. He'd heard there was something happening and had driven over from the Aldridge place without being asked. Lila Chambers had stopped by on an unrelated errand the night before, and I'd asked her if she'd like to stay for the meeting. She'd said yes without asking what the meeting was about. We all sat at the Macready kitchen table. Duval set his briefcase on the floor and opened a file folder. I'm here to verify Priority Certificate 371, Aldridge Creek, before processing the transfer application filed in December, he said. He looked at Warren and Roy. The application was filed by Aldridge Ranch, LLC, seeking transfer of the right to a Colorado entity. He looked at me. You're Clara Aldridge Macready? I am, I said. Then you're the current holder of record. He set a certified copy of the priority certificate on the table. Prior appropriation rights in Wyoming required a written authorization of the holder of record for any transfer. The holder of record for this certificate is Clara Emmett Aldridge, with original registration dated April 12, 1889, and a successor designation added at the time of original registration, naming Clara Emmett Aldridge as the heir holder. He looked at the document. Did you authorize this transfer? I did not. Warren opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Duval looked at him. Do you have documentation that contradicts the holder of record? Warren looked at Roy. Roy looked at the table. The ranch is ours, Warren said. We inherited it. The water right is separate from the surface estate, Duval said, with the tone of a man who has explained this before and will explain it again as many times as necessary. It's a real property right, and its ownership is governed by registration with this office, not by land inheritance. He tapped the certificate. This right was registered in Ms. Aldridge's name as a specific successor at the time of original filing, which means it transferred to her at the time of her grandfather's death by operation of the registration document itself, not through the estate. Our grandfather never told us, Warren began. He told the state engineer's office, Duval said. The room was quiet for a moment. I set the deed on the table. I set the brand registration beside it. I had certified copies of both, obtained through the county clerk, and Holt had verified each with the relevant agencies before that morning. Warren looked at the deed. He looked at it for a long time. Section 14 is the home place, he said. Yes, I said. He deeded you the home place. Before he died. Yes, a year before. It's recorded at the county clerk's office, book 472, page 91. The county clerk confirmed it when Holt pulled the records. Roy stood up. Something's wrong with the paperwork. Granddad wouldn't have. The brand registration is here, I said. It's in my name. He re-registered it 2 years before he died. I pushed it across the table toward Roy. He looked at it. The brand inspector's signature was there. The date was there. And Emmett James Aldridge had signed the re-registration application. And at the bottom, in his blocky, careful handwriting, in the space marked additional notes, he had written, This brand belongs to Clara. She is the one who will keep the cattle right. Roy sat back down. Pete Greer cleared his throat. He'd been sitting at the end of the table with his hat in his hands, and now he said, I knew about the deed. Everyone looked at him. Not the water right, he said. Not the brand registration. But the deed I knew. Emmett told me after he filed it. He said he'd put the home section in Clara's name because he didn't want to see it sold off. He told me he'd try to talk to Warren and Roy about the cattle and the water, and he could see they didn't understand what they were looking at, and he wasn't going to leave something that mattered to people who couldn't be bothered to understand it. Pete set his hat on the table. He said Clara was the only one of his grandchildren who knew what the ranch was for. Warren's face had gone through several expressions while Pete was talking. It had settled, by the end, into something that was hard to name. Not anger. Something more like a man standing in a room where all the furniture has been moved, trying to figure out how it happened. Roy said, Why didn't Granddad just tell us? Pete looked at him. He did tell you. He tried to tell you about the water right one spring when you were up here, and you told him water law was too complicated, and you'd have someone look at it later. Roy said nothing. Jean Duval had been listening to all of this with the careful attention of a man who has understood his paperwork from the beginning and is simply waiting for the other parties to catch up. He gathered his folder, made a note on his form, and said to me, The transfer application cannot proceed without your written authorization. I'll note the dispute for the record and close out the application. If you'd like to file anything with the office about the right itself, my contact information is on the notification letter. He looked at Warren and Roy in a way that was not unkind but not especially warm. Gentlemen, I'd suggest you consult an attorney before filing any further applications involving this water right. He packed his briefcase, thanked us for the coffee, and left. Roy was the first one to speak after Duval's truck pulled out of the yard. "This is Clara being difficult," he said. "This is her making trouble, because she's always had to be the center of things." I looked at him. Lila Chambers looked at him. Pete looked at him. Holt looked at him. "Roy," Warren said. His voice had changed. The authority had gone out of it. He sounded tired. "We inherited that ranch," Roy said. "It was always ours. If Granddad filed some paperwork that didn't go through the estate properly, that's a legal question. Not. The deed is recorded," Holt said. It was the first thing Holt had said in the past hour. He said it without raising his voice. "It was recorded at the county clerk's office while your grandfather was alive. It's a warranty deed. It transfers title. It's not a question." Roy looked at him. "The water right has a successor designation in the original registration," Holt said. "That's not a mistake, and it's not a technicality. Emmett Aldridge put those things in Clara's name on purpose, at different times, over at least 3 years, which means he thought about it carefully. He knew exactly what he was doing." Roy turned to me. "You put him up to this. You've always—" "Roy." Warren's voice was flat and sharp enough that Roy stopped. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving around the eaves of the Macready house in a way that made itself heard. Holt's border collie, who had been lying under the table, got up and moved to lie beside the wood stove. Warren put his elbows on the table and looked at his hands. It took him a while to say anything. When he did, his voice was different from any voice I had heard from him in the 3 years since our grandfather died. "When did he file the deed?" he said. "September 9th. I said, "The year before he died." "September 9th. He nodded to himself. "He called me in August that year. He said he wanted to talk about the ranch, about how he was thinking about the future of it. I told him I was in the middle of something. I told him to write it down, and I'd look at it when I was up in the fall." The room was very still. "I never went up that fall," Warren said. "I kept putting it off. He died in February." He paused. "I told myself I'd deal with the ranch when I got there. I figured it was all going to sort itself out." Pete Greer's jaw tightened. "He tried to tell you," I said, not as an accusation, as a fact that needed to be said plainly so it could sit in the room with us. "Yes," Warren said. "I know." Roy leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has not yet decided whether to be angry or ashamed, holding both options open while he figures out which one costs less. I had seen that expression on Roy's face my whole life. It usually resolved into anger, which required nothing of him. This time it didn't. "We knew about the brand registration," Roy said. Warren closed his eyes. "We found it about a week after the funeral." Roy went on. "We were going through Granddad's papers in the office. Warren pulled the brand file and it had Clara's name on it. And we looked at each other and neither of us said anything, and we put it back in the file." He looked at the table. "We told ourselves it was probably a clerical error, or that it wouldn't matter because Clara was going to be living on the ranch anyway. But it was easier if I wasn't," I said. Roy didn't answer that. "The water right we didn't know about," Warren said. "I believe that's true. We just assumed it was part of the ranch." He rubbed his face with both hands. "But the brand registration. We knew about that, and we put it back in the file and didn't say anything, and then we sent you up to Powder Creek. The honest accounting of it sat in the room and didn't go anywhere." Lila Chambers was looking at the wall. Pete had his hands flat on the table. Holt was looking at me. There was something else I needed Warren to say, and I waited to see if he would say it without being asked. A long silence filled the room, the kind of silence that has weight in it. The border collie shifted by the wood stove. The fire ticked. "When you were here," Warren said, finally, "I knew you were the one running things. Not officially, but I knew. You were the one who knew where the cattle were. You were the one who kept the headgate going. You knew which pastures needed rest and which ones could take another month." He looked at his hands. "I told myself it didn't matter because I was the one on the deed. I told myself that made it mine in any way that counted." He stopped. "It didn't make it mine. It just made me the one whose name was written down." Pete Greer let out a long breath and looked at the ceiling. I thought about the morning Warren came to my door, the matter-of-fact tone, the transaction already completed. I thought about riding north to a stranger's ranch with a bag of clothes and my mother's Bible, because my brothers had found it simpler to move me out of the way than to face what our grandfather had decided. I thought about Emmett at the kitchen sink, his hands wet from washing up. People who need to take things from other people usually can't stand the thought that those people earned them. He'd known Warren and Roy might find the brand registration, and he'd made the water right, and the deed so airtight that even if they ignored the brand, the other pieces would eventually surface on their own. He'd planned for it. He'd left me a path, even when he couldn't tell me where it was. "I want to ask you something," I said to Warren. He looked up. "Did you think I'd never come back?" A long pause. "I thought," Warren said slowly, "that once you were settled up there, you'd have enough to keep you, and you wouldn't want to deal with the ranch. I thought it would be cleaner." He stopped. I was wrong. Roy said nothing. I sat with that for a while. The anger I might have expected wasn't exactly what was there. There was something more complicated. The kind of ache that comes when you understand that someone didn't hurt you out of malice so much as out of failure or courage, which is its own kind of hurt and maybe harder to put down than the other kind. I took 2 days before I said anything about what came next. I rode the Macready pastures in the morning and thought. I helped Orville break ice on the stock tanks and thought. I sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with the documents in front of me and Holt across from me, reading or working on something, not pushing while I thought. There were things I was sure of by the end of the second day. The Aldridge Creek water, right, would stay in my name. It would be properly maintained with annual diversion records, and any application to transfer, assign, or lease that right would require my signature. Warren could use the water for stock on the sections he legitimately owned, under an access agreement that I would draft with an attorney. But the right itself was going nowhere. The home section, Section 14, would stay in my name. I wasn't going to move back into the house full time, but I wasn't going to deed it back to Warren and Roy either. I wanted protected. I had specific ideas about what protection looked like. The running a brand was mine. Any cattle sold under that brand required my authorization through the brand inspector. Warren and Roy could continue running cattle, but not under the running A, not without my say, which was both a legal reality and a practical one. Their cattle couldn't go to the sale barn under a brand they didn't own. I drove down to the Aldridge place on the third day and sat at the kitchen table with Warren, without Roy, which I had asked for specifically. Roy was not ready to have this conversation the right way, and I could not afford to let Roy's stubbornness shape the outcome. Warren looked like he hadn't slept well. I had driven the home section that morning before leaving. The ground was still frozen, an inch below the surface. The creek was running low but clear. The south corral was still unrepaired. The barn roof had a new sag on the east side that hadn't been there when I'd left in October. None of that had happened through malice exactly. It had happened through the ordinary accumulation of inattention, which can do as much damage as deliberate neglect over the course of a few years. I thought about Emmett, the way he'd walked the whole property every spring without fail, every fence line, every structure, every waterway, the way he'd treat a split board on a corral the same week it split, the way he kept things from compounding. That was the thing Warren had never understood about the ranch, and Roy had never bothered to try. The work isn't intermittent. You don't tend to it when it's convenient. You tend to it because it cannot wait. "I want to tell you what I'm going to do," I said. "I want you to listen before you say anything." He nodded. I laid it out. The water right. I keep it. You use it by agreement. We document the terms properly through the state engineer's office. The home section. I keep it. But I'll set up a life estate provision so that you can live in a house as long as you want to, and you can run cattle on a home pasture. But you can't sell it or subdivide it without my consent. The brand. I control it. But if you're willing to run an honest outfit, I'll authorize its use on cattle you're managing, and we'll keep the running going. In exchange, I said, I want Pete Greer kept on. I want the headgate on Aldridge Creek properly maintained, which means someone goes up there every 2 weeks during diversion season. And I want the upper pastures rested this year. The least cattle overgraze them. The land needs a season. Warren sat with all of that, Roy won't like it, he said. Roy's name isn't on the water right or the deed or the brand registration. I said, Roy can manage his share of the inherited sections and make his own decisions about them. But these 3 things are mine, and this is what I'm willing to do with them. A long silence. Granddad was right about you, Warren said. He said it without resentment, which surprised me. He said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time, and you are only just now letting yourself acknowledge out loud. He tried to tell me, when you were maybe 15, 16. He said Clara sees the ranch the way I see it. I didn't want to hear it. I let that sit. Will you do it? I said, yes, Warren said. He said it without conditions and without qualifications. Just yes. It might have been the most honest thing he'd said to me in 30 years. Roy, in the end, chose not to fight it. The alternative was a lawsuit, and Roy understood enough about the legal situation to know he would lose. He backed away from the active management of the ranch, kept his share of the inherited sections, and hired someone to run his cattle for him. I heard later he'd moved to Casper for a while. Whether that was shame or just the kind of decision a man makes when a place has become uncomfortable for him, I couldn't say. Pete Greer shook my hand the day after I sat down with Warren. He didn't make a speech about it. He said, your granddad would have wanted this. He put his hat on and went back to work. The Johnson County Brand Inspector came out in March to update the running of registration and confirm the current holder. He looked at the documents, asked a few questions, wrote something in his record book, and left. The brand was current. The brand was mine. Holt drove out to the Aldridge place with me the first week of April, when the snow was going off the hills and Aldridge Creek was running fast and cold. We rode up to the headgate together, and I checked the diversion and recorded the measurement in the log the way Emmett had taught me. The way I had been doing every spring for 12 years without anyone asking me to. Holt stood to the side and watched me work. On the ride back, he said, you going to be all right with how it came out? I thought about Warren's face at the kitchen table. I thought about Roy's silence. I thought about Pete Greer put his hat back on. Yes, I said, I think I am. He nodded, and we rode back toward the Macready headquarters in the last of the afternoon light. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.